Well, good morning, East Campus. How we doing? Good morning, East Campus. How we doing? That's a little bit better. Hey, it's good to be back here with you guys. I hope that you've had a great week this past week. If you're new here, my name is Drew. I'm the student pastor. I'd love to meet you at the connection table when we get done here today. If you're not new and I still haven't had a time to have some conversation with you, I'd still love to meet up with you outside. And so over the past few weeks, we have been walking through a series about how we can move forward as a church. And so a few weeks ago, Pastor Doug talked about how we as a church should pray big prayers. In the last few days, we've actually had some opportunities to do so, to pray at our future property to where we will be moving in the near future. Some big prayers for our future as a church, our community, and other things that we really are praying big for God to do here on earth. And so before we continue, I really just want to celebrate some of those volunteers this morning. Can we celebrate those that made that happen over the past few days? If you don't know, we prayed from 6 o'clock Friday to 6 o'clock Saturday, a 24-hour prayer vigil. And we had volunteers who were able to kind of make that happen at different shifts for people to come and pray. I know Pastor Doug was saying that he was there, I think 3 to 5, right? 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. and some guys came and prayed. And so I just want to say thank you to the volunteers who made that happen. Giving up sleep is really hard. I understand that, okay? But today we're going to be continuing in this series. As we move forward, we need to exhibit irrational obedience. And so I think that when we think about obedience, we automatically connect it to clear directions and logical steps in why we make the decisions we make, right? But I think that the question this morning that we need to ask ourselves is this, is what our response to God is when He calls us to do something that may not make much sense. Now, this kind of reminds me of the time that I tried to assemble some IKEA furniture. Has anybody ever bought some IKEA furniture before? Okay. It's really cheap, but it takes forever to put together, right? And so I actually want to show you this picture real fast, this cabinet that I actually put together. You see how it kind of looks a little crooked, a little uneven, okay? So I tried to assemble this IKEA furniture actually without any instructions. Men in the room, you can probably relate to that as well, right? We don't need any instruction manuals, right? We know how to put it together. My wife keeps telling me now that she's going to not allow me to put any of our furniture together because she loves doing it. Yeah, let's give her a hand, right? Like, to the point where she is actually even trying to get the instruction manuals in Spanish so I can't understand them, okay? She speaks Spanish, I don't. But so when I put this cabinet together, I ended up having pieces left over. I was certain that I had built like maybe a new type of furniture, right? Like I was fixing to call IKEA and say, hey, let's put this thing on the market, right? I like to tell my wife, it's kind of like art. You got to squint, and you can see how well it is, right? Like with some cases of art. But just like this experience, obeying God can sometimes feel like that we are building something without the manual, right? It doesn't make sense sometimes when God calls us to obey Him, but we are called to trust the process and obey. And I think for me that I really struggle sometimes to trust God in the unknown, right? Like I trust, I think it's a control thing. Not that I'm very controlling, but it's just I want to be in control of my future, right? I want to be in control of tomorrow so I'm prepared for tomorrow and be able to prevent certain outcomes. I can believe that many of us in the room have probably experienced a similar struggle. And maybe it hasn't been with control, but for some of us, maybe we struggle with the uncertainty of obeying God, right? Like if I obey God and I give Him my life and I give Him my time, what's going to happen? Like maybe how it'll affect our lives, our families, maybe even people's view of us, our jobs, and even our financial well-being, our future. What happens to these things when we finally say, yes, Lord, I obey you, regardless of what I see? As Randy just fantastically put it, when we don't see the way, He makes the way. And so if we're ever going to move forward as a church or as Christians, I believe that we must obey God irrationally, even when it does not make sense. This word irrational means like illogical, right? Like when it doesn't make sense in our world, when it doesn't make sense in our families, when it doesn't make sense in our friend groups or our jobs, we are called to obey. It's about trusting God even when the path ahead does not look clear. And so today we're going to look at a passage where the nation of Israel displayed this type of irrational obedience to God even when it made no sense. And so if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn with me to Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6, and this is a familiar story to all of you in the room. And it's known as the Wall of Jericho. The Wall of Jericho. And so if you would look at the screen behind me, or if you have a Bible at the verses we read, we're going to read verses 1 through 5. Let's get it. All right. Now Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites. No one leaving or entering. The Lord said to Joshua, look, I have handed Jericho, its king, its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all of the men of war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times. While the priests blow the ram's horn, when there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear its sound, have all the troops give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will collapse and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead. Now look, as we begin this passage, the city of Jericho, which is one of the larger fortresses in the land of Canaan, is on high alert due to the fact that the people of Israel being right outside of their city walls. They've heard of the things that God has done through the Israelites as he has brought them out of Egypt into the wilderness. Now look, I love a good underdog story. Okay? I don't know if any of you guys can relate in the room. And here the Israelites are the underdogs in the fight as the city of Jericho is heavily fortified. The city itself was known to be surrounded by an outer wall that was 40 feet high and another inner wall that was 26 feet high, and each one being 6 feet thick. Now, due to this potential attack, it says that what the people of Jericho have done is they have closed off their gates, preventing people from leaving or entering. There's no way in. There's no way out. What Jericho will have to do in this moment is face an unequipped, inexperienced group of fighting men. Now, I was born in 1994. That seems like forever ago, but really not too far ago, okay? But one of my favorite movies from the 90s is The Little Giants. I don't know if anybody has ever seen it. I got a picture, The Little Giants. It's a football movie. It's a sports movie. It's when movies were actually really good and wholesome and funny and family-oriented, right? And so here in this movie, we have 2 different teams, okay? Now we have, and they're brothers, and they're going to have this pee-wee football competition between the 2. And we see the guy with the team like the Cowboys. Remember, this movie was made in the 90s when the Cowboys were actually good, okay? We know that, okay? And so this movie was made when the Cowboys were pretty good. And then we have this other team, and they don't look too good, do they? They look like they were just kind of thrown together. And this is kind of what I imagine the Israelites looking like as they're going to fight against the city of Jericho, right? You've got these big, stout, actual, football players on this side, but then you have these just ragtag, thrown together, people on this side. And so I think it's impossible that the Israelites would overcome Jericho, right? As they were this well-fortified, well-trained, well-equipped city. But God tells Joshua, if you could, Caleb, go ahead and put those verses back on, verses 1 through 5. God tells Joshua in the face of the impossible that he has handed this city over to him. From a divine perspective, Jericho has already lost and the battle has not even began. All that is needed from the Israelites is obedience to what God instructs them to do. To send their warriors to march around the city one time a day for 6 days in a row. Have the 7 priests accompany them with the ark and 7 trumpets. And on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times while the priests blow their trumpets. And what God says is this: the walls will come crashing down. I'm sure that those in the room who've been in the military, and we have some guys who've served in the military, and we're thankful for your service, they hear this and they believe that this plan to be probably irrational, right? Like this battle plan that God is giving these men makes no sense. There's no logical reasoning for God to command the Israelites to have this type of battle plan to attack with no weapons, but with instruments and even silence. Talk about a battle of the bands, right? Like from the human standpoint, like this doesn't make sense. It seems ineffective. But I believe that God often uses the unconventional to challenge our understandings, our expectations, and our views of God to grow our faith in him. He even calls us to depend on him, as Randy said earlier, even when we do not understand or see it or feel it. This plan that God has developed is not dependent on military strategy or might, but on himself. This group of people he's communicating towards responds in one way, which I think that all of us in the room need to respond like when God commands us to do something, and it's this: irrational obedience. As we continue, verse 6, we see that what Joshua does is he immediately goes and tells the men. It says that so Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant and have 7 priests carry 7 ram horns in front of the ark of the Lord." He said to the troops, "Move forward, march around the city, and have the armed men go ahead of the Lord, the ark of the Lord." Church, what we need to understand is this, is that big faith produces irrational obedience. Big faith produces irrational obedience. Joshua's response was to be obedient to follow God's irrational battle plan. He did not delay in telling the Israelite people what God had commanded them exactly to do. He didn't question it, he just did it, right? And I believe that this is a sign of his faith that he has in God. That God was calling Joshua to lead the Israelites in a crazy, irrational, illogical battle plan. But he obeyed God because he had big faith in who God is and what God would do. Listen, when God calls us to follow his plans that maybe don't make sense, what we should do is we should respond with irrational haste, right? Like we shouldn't dilly-dally. It should be an immediate response of this: "Yes, Lord." Joshua trusted in God's plan, and what did it do? It led him to obey God's plan. I'm sure that Israel had to keep their hearts and minds on the fact that God was present with them instead of putting it on the impossible task ahead. And I believe this: our hearts and our minds have to be set on the things of above. So when God calls us to do the impossible, we do it. When we have a faith in God that is big, true, real, it leads us to obey in every area of our lives. That the situation in front of us might not make sense. What God is calling us to do might seem illogical, but we know that God is higher than what is in front of us. Verse 8, Joshua continues. It says, "After Joshua had spoken to the troops, 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns before the Lord moved forward and blew the ram's horns. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of the priest who blew the ram's horns, and the rear guard went behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the troops, 'Do not shout or let your voice be heard. Don't let one word come out of your mouth until the time I say, shout, then you are to shout.' So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once. They returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of them, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. On the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp." They did this for 6 days. See, the Israelites, they obeyed Joshua's command to march around the city. And if I'm being real, I think that probably after the first few days of kind of not seeing results, I probably would have went back to the camp, right? Like it's easy for us to say, hey, no, like we would have done what God had called us to do, right? It's easy for us in the room to say that. Why? Because, we have God's word that's been complete. It's easy for us to say, no, we would have kept marching. We would have stayed silent around the city because we know how the story ends. We can read ahead. They didn't. They didn't know what was to come by doing this. They didn't know how it was going to play out. In this moment, all they knew was to trust God in the situation. I believe that it took courage for the Israelites to keep marching for 6 days. At any moment, they could have been attacked or said, hey, this just isn't working. We're not getting the results that we thought we were going to get. Let's go back to the camp. But what they did is they persevered. And I believe that irrational obedience perseveres in the uncertainty. Irrational obedience perseveres in the uncertainty. That when it does not make sense around me, we still follow God and what he calls us to do. That we persevere despite difficulties, failure, or opposition. We put our eyes on Jesus and stay faithful to what he has called us to do. I think that there is something in each and every one of our lives that has the potential from keeping us of being faithful to God. For some of us, it's being uncomfortable to what God calls us to do. For some of us, maybe it's difficult times in our lives. It leads us to maybe sometimes question God's plan. Or maybe, like I said earlier, in the uncertainty of tomorrow or how our world is functioning, it leads us to question God's faithfulness. I believe that it takes perseverance to remain faithful in your walk with God. When he has called you to do something that is irrational in the eyes of the world, that does not make sense. We are called to have a faith that perseveres. I believe this, that how you live your life, how you live out your faith demonstrates what you believe about God. Do you believe that God is in control? Do you believe that God is good? Do you believe that God is loving? Then it's going to reflect in how you live your everyday life. What led these people to display such irrational faith here at Jericho? Think about it. Why? They walked around a wall with trumpets silently with no weapons. It's because they remembered the previous events where they had witnessed God's faithfulness, where he provided manna for them in the wilderness and split the Jordan River for them to cross. Their remembrance of what God did fueled their faith of what God could do. They were also following the Ark of the Covenant, which is God's presence, which had led them through the wilderness. Look, I'm sure all of us in this room have had a moment where we look back at when God showed up in our lives, right? All of us do. Most of us would say it's our testimony, right? It's our story. And when we can look back and see, man, God showed up. God did this. God set me free. We don't need to forget that. As I said earlier, big faith produces irrational obedience. I believe that when we remember what God has done in each of our lives previously or even now, it helps grow our faith and leads us to do what? Obey God. When we follow his presence, he leads us to what we need to be and where we need to be. Verse 15. Let's see the response of what happens when we obey God. Early on the seventh day, they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way. That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time, the priests blew the ram's horn, and Joshua said to the troops, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. For all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury." So the troops shouted, and the ram's horn sounded. When they heard the blast of the ram's horn, the troops gave a great shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops advanced into the city, and each man straight ahead, and they captured the city, for the day was the Lord's. I believe that irrational obedience leads to significant outcomes. That when we step out in irrational obedience to what God has called us to do, where God has called us to go, we will witness God's power in ways that we never expected. That when we obey God, what does he do? He shows up. He honors our obedience. Church, listen to me. Obedience is not legalism. That when we obey God, he moves in ways that only we sometimes can see. Because of the Israelites' obedience to what God commanded them to do, he showed up. The walls of Jericho fell completely flat for them to take the city. God gave the Israelites victory in a way that was irrational. But I believe that this is how our God works. He takes the most irrational situation, the most illogical situation, and what does he do? He uses it for his glory. He uses the most uncommon, unqualified people to further his plan. This is my story. That I can't do this through my power, but he can. And church, listen, all he wants from you today is for you just to say yes to him. The power to defeat our Jerichos will not come through our methods, our skills, our reputations, our titles, or anything else that we think will lead us to be victorious. God will have to do it. And I believe that God often brings victory in ways we can't predict. And obedience, what it does is it leads to divine intervention from the Almighty. So today, I want to challenge you to commit to trusting in God by these few things from the passage. Number one, obey irrationally. Obey when it doesn't make sense. Obey when it's illogical in the world that we live in. God calls each and every one of us to obey him in every area of our lives, even when we don't understand it. Listen, God is calling you this morning to step out in faith. For some of you, this can look like leaving behind your old sinful life, right? Because God has better for us. For others, this can look like stepping into what God is calling you to do, despite what others think of you. For others, maybe God is pressing in your heart to maybe even partner with us as a church within our vision campaign forward to help further the kingdom work here in East Orlando. Whatever it looks like in your life, obey God. Even when you don't have the answers. Even when you can't see what's to come. Number two, reflect on God's faithfulness. Listen, there's been times in my life personally where I have struggled to obey God and what he's called me to do. Because I thought my ways were better. Like the Israelites did at Jericho, we need to remember what God has done. Because I believe the minute we forget what God has done, we will forget what he could do here and now. And it'll lead us into disobedience. Remember how he saved your marriage? Remember how he's never given up on you despite your sin? When we reflect on these actions or characteristics of God, it can empower us to stay faithful to him and do what he has called us to do. Ways you can do this, and this is from me personally too. I do this, so I'm not saying this is like the best thing out there to do, but I like to keep a journal and write down how God has done something faithful, like in my life. Like I found a journal like in my office this past week, and it was like from 2016. I was like, man, I need to throw this away. It's like yellow, like pages are yellow, and I'm flipping through it, and I'm seeing like different prayer requests that I had where God has faithfully shown up. But I'm also seeing certain struggles that I dealt with then where God has stayed faithful despite it. Keep a journal, write down how God has done something faithful in your life so when you can look back, you can reflect on it. You can also read verses that emphasize God's faithfulness, like Psalm 136 or Lamentations 3, 22 through 23. Spend time meditating on these verses, letting their truths resonate in your heart. Don't ever forget what God has done. Don't ever forget what God has done in your life. Don't ever forget what God has done in those around you. Don't forget ever the sacrifice God has made, the cost of what he did for us. Number three, expect the walls to fall. When we obey God, I believe that we should anticipate that God will work in our lives and he'll fulfill his promises according to his will. This looks like believing God for what he says, praying to God for the outcome, and approaching obedience not just as a duty, but with a heart full of hope and confidence that God is actively involved in your life. As Randy said earlier in that song, like I'm kind of getting emotional, like singing that song and hearing what the truth that Randy's saying, and like he is here. He is here with us. He's actively involved in your life. He cares about everything that's going on. And so we need to approach obedience with a heart full of hope and confidence that, hey, he's actively doing what he's going to say that he does. Church, as we close, I believe that when we as believers would step out in faith and obey God irrationally, then we would begin to see transformation in each of our lives. As we obey God's prompting to give, serve, forgive, and step into the call that God has placed on our lives, we will see a transformation happen here in our church, and we will see a transformation happen in our community. As theologian and author C.S. Lewis wrote, obedience is the road to freedom. Do you want to be set free? Obey. As we close, I ask you to see that running from God, not following in obedience, is always a downgrade to what God has in store for us. I want to call each of you, as we go into a time of worship, to step out with irrational obedience in your relationship with God. God is calling some of you to obey him in your relationships, your career decisions, a call to ministry, or even a commitment to serve. If you're ready to take that step of faith, I want to invite you to come forward and take time to pray here at the stage about what God is calling you to do. And maybe you're uncertain. I want to call you as well to figure out what type of irrational obedience that God is calling you to make. Let's pray.